community college, entrepreneurial risk takers, federal and state support for R&D, an effective judicial system, protection for intellectual property. The list goes on. What stands out is that we should think of, in my view, the visible hand of an investing entrepreneurial state coupled with the magic of the marketplace driven by the famous invisible hand. To explore the world of public-private partnerships, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce the Honorable Jacques Gansler. Professor Gansler is currently the Roger C. Lipsitz Chair in Public Policy and Private Enterprise at the University of Maryland. He also directs the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise. You can see why we really wanted to have him here today. A fellow in the School of Engineering and an affiliate faculty member in the School of Business. So he really is kind of a multi-partnership person in himself. He has an extraordinarily accomplished career. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics in the Clinton administration, a second round in the government, Senior VP and Corporate Director for Task, senior positions with ITT, Singer, and Raytheon. He has served and serves on a host of corporate boards and governmental advisory boards. He is currently a member of the Defense Science Board and Comptroller General's, the gentleman who runs the GAO advisory board as well, and in addition is deeply involved in running, I think, at least 3 projects at the National Academies. Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Does that work? You bet. Okay. Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Okay. See if this works. Yeah, believe it or not. Okay, what I will be doing is talking about the current environment, the challenges we're facing, and what are the choices for meeting that challenge. And I'm doing it from a structural perspective because Ken specifically asked me to talk about public-private partnership and how that fits into this. And so I will then go into that in much more detail in terms of the types of partnerships, when it makes sense, and what are the benefits, and I'll give examples as we go through it. Okay. This, and since you're all in Washington, it comes as no surprise to you that we have a fiscal problem. And frankly, a lack of leadership on either the executive or legislative branches with regard to this crisis. And not only do we have shrinking appropriations, but we have adverse trends relative to the direction that we're going financially. We're certainly seeing cost increases in energy and in many other areas, medicine certainly. And there's some analyses that I've seen, independent analyses that say by 2017, the payment on the debt alone will equal the defense budget. Demographics, every day in America, 10,000 people age into Social Security. So the cost of Social Security is going to continue to go up. And in terms of when I show you the declining budgets that we've had in the cycles in the defense area that I'm most familiar with, as Ken pointed out, every time we've had a declining budget of significance, the first 3 things that always go are travel, training, and research. Training and research, certainly not forward-looking, and research, if we want to maintain either economic competitiveness or technological superiority, which has been our strategy in security, the decline in the research budget is a serious issue as well. Now, what about the world? The world is not in very good shape in terms of, I mean, if I were giving this talk 10 years ago, I wouldn't have started off with pirates, but I think obviously I've got to throw them in. But we can go through cyber attacks, which are increasing rapidly. I get briefed all the time on how many and where they're coming from and what their effects are. Chem-bionuclear, you know, we're hearing about that now in Iraq and so forth. The roadside bombs, the so-called IEDs, the instabilities in the world that are drawing us in many cases, the proliferation, the loose nukes. I could go on with this list. And clearly the problem is, if we wanted to address each of them, we could, but we don't have enough money to separately address all of them. It's too expensive. And we don't know which is next, so we don't know exactly how to prepare for them. That's uncertainty. And then the last problem I list here, and I'm going to go into it in much more detail, is the government workforce itself. The people who do the buying of the weapons and of all the other things from all the government agencies, not just defense. And I'll give you some data on that, but we basically, other than the people in this room, have an aging workforce. And clearly the government has been undervaluing that workforce. In fact, the head of the House Armed Services Committee at one point, when he cut the defense acquisition workforce by 25%, simply said, they're nothing but shoppers. What do we need them for? And smart buyers does matter. And so I want to talk about that. And I will also point out this inexperience point that I noted up here on the chart. Today, in the total federal government, more than 50% of the workforce have less than 5 years of experience. In the defense area, it's 55%. Okay. This is the problem pictorially. And I want to focus obviously on this area, but it's these prior ones where I learned that lesson about what gets cut first. But you can see what we've been doing is cutting the troops. That's heading towards zero. But can we have an effective force without troops is the question. And what we don't know, and what Congress is certainly not helping us with, is how far this is going to go down. And when those 535 people stop fighting and acting like young children, we'll maybe get some kind of ability to plan. But how can you do any kind of effective, efficient planning without knowing what your future is? And that's the situation that we're facing right now relative to sequestration. And this is one chart that I just stole from Exelis, giving you a little idea of the world's instability. It's not in great shape, no matter which piece of it you pick and for what reasons. These are the reasons over here, and most of the world's in pretty bad shape. Now, the acquisition workforce, I thought this would be a pictorial way to show this problem. The end of the Cold War, the budget was declining, so naturally you'd cut back on the acquisition workforce. This is where the Congress cut the 25% here, and then 9/11 came along. And so we dramatically increased the defense budget. But that paid for more pilots and ship drivers and tank commanders and things like that. But when the budget goes up like this, essentially more than doubling during this period, you want smart buyers. Now what you have is much more money and far fewer people to do it. And that kind of is a way of showing, I think, a crisis situation relative to the workforce. And more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that many of those people who were cut or retired were not replaced at the senior levels. So, for example, the Army had 5 general officers in 1990 with contracting background, but they weren't replaced. When I did a commission for Secretary Gates, I found, surprisingly, it was 0 general officers with contracting background. Defense Contract Management Agency, which is supposed to oversee contract management by name, they had 4 general officers, and they went to 0. And they went from 25,000 people to supervise to 10,000 people to supervise. And that's what I was trying to point out about the impact on the workforce. And as I said, we have more than 50% of them with less than 5 years of experience, and very few who really understand how industry works. And that I think is critical. If you want to create incentives for people, you really have to understand what motivates them. And so that's what I would like to come back to and talk about the importance of it. Now, I sort of somewhat cynically point out here that while Congress, GAO, others have recognized the importance of the acquisition workforce, closing the government did not create a great incentive for people to join the government. It certainly, in fact, was a clear disincentive. And I put in a plug for a program that I'm running now at Maryland, where we are trying to set up a master's program in acquisition specialization for, I do think education helps. Okay, so how do we meet these challenges? Some of the options that have been brought up, insourcing was one that was very popular with the current administration at one point, and I'll give you some data on that. Do you privatize everything automatically, or is that fair to the current workforce? Or do you allow them to compete in a public-private competition? Or do you, in fact, even better, maybe form public-private partnerships? And I make the general observation here that I think the role of the government has been changing from the doer to the manager of the doers. And that's one of the things we'll talk about now. But as I said, the first thing that you may remember, President Obama said, well, we're going to solve this problem by insourcing into the government. And there were some studies that were done about this, Congressional Budget Office. The first thing the Air Force chose to do was to say, well, we'll do the maintenance of our airplanes then, and we'll save a lot of money, 40%, but they said, because our labor force is much cheaper. And what they were comparing was the direct cost of their labor force with the fully loaded cost of the private sector, where they have to pay for the facilities, the lawyers, the finance, the IT, and so forth. The interesting thing is when this idea was actually looked at by independent third parties, the Congressional Budget Office, they said that it was 90% more expensive to bring it in-house than to have competitive contractors doing it when you include the full cost of the overhead for the government. I mean, I actually had this discussion with Secretary Gates at one point when he was going to bring 33,000 people into the Pentagon. And I pointed out they're going to have to sit out in the lawn because there's no room for them, and that heat, gas, electric, and so forth, and the IT support and the legal support and the finance support, all overhead. And you're not going to save that 40% that you expected to get. And as a few, actually I guess it was just a little over a year later, he said, we're not getting the savings we thought we would. And so he kind of stopped that. I should point out, I guess the GAO made the same comparison relative to security guards, and they said it was 10 times more expensive to use State Department people than it was to use competitive contracting. And as I said, the Air Force chose to decide to save 40% by maintaining all this equipment. And I guess you've all read the Constitution, and I can't remember ever seeing in there that wrench turning is inherently governmental. I don't think it is. And one of the big issues here is what is inherently governmental. There are clearly functions that are inherently governmental. Source selection, management, budgeting. Warfighting, I would think, is inherently governmental. I prefer it that way, certainly. But I don't think wrench turning is inherently governmental. It certainly is something that is done in the commercial world all the time. So maybe this should be done competitively. So maybe you want to be fair to the government worker and let them have an opportunity as well. This is an example of outsourcing services competitively, but still doing it in a sense in the private sector, taking something like information technology, which again is probably not something that, certainly when the Constitution was written, they didn't have the internet, in spite of what Al Gore claims to have invented it. You know, clearly the internet is not necessarily, it was invented by the public sector. Actually, it came out of DARPA that I'm sure you're all aware of. But NASA and NSA both decided that they would outsource IT services. And in both cases, the objective was, as noted here, you know, cutting costs and improving quality and letting the federal workers concentrate on the basic missions of, in this case, NASA and National Security Agency. And in both cases, the performance improvements were significant and the cost savings were quite significant. In this case, for NSA, it was a 40% cost savings by consolidating some of the systems, taking over 3,000 users and providing the IT for them. So clearly there are cases in which for non-inherently governmental functions, we should consider privatization or outsourcing based on that data that I just showed you. But I would argue that in the interest of fairness, it's important, and especially because the government workers do know these jobs so well, you want to give them the opportunity to bid. So that's why I bring up public-private competitions for non-inherently governmental work. I think it's a good option. As I said, it's for non-inherently governmental work, but it's work that could be provided. Some people cynically say, well, if you can find it in the yellow pages, they should be allowed to bid. This is kind of the commercial type functions, like wrench turning. I mean, that certainly is one of them. Check printing, I can go down a long list of things that could be done. What's interesting is when the competitions take place, the government more than 50% of the time wins because of the skills that they have. And it's not a surprise to me at all. But when they do, or when the private sector wins, it's still a win-win in the sense that performance goes up and costs go down rather dramatically. And we introduce the presence of competition to create incentives. So this is not a question of whether something should be done in the public sector or whether it should be done in the private sector. The issue is the incentives for competition. And does competition, in fact, make a difference? Which, of course, all our speeches say we're going to do, but where in reality, when we do it sole source, it isn't. And Congress frequently will pass laws to make it sole source. For example, that maintenance example I just gave you a few minutes ago, Congress passed a law that says 50% of all maintenance work by the Department of Defense must be done by government workers in government facilities. So last year, the total cost for the logistics area was $210 billion for the Department of Defense, and 50% of all maintenance work within that must be done sole source by government workers in government facilities. Now, compare that to the data I'm going to show you on what has happened when we ran competitions. This is an older set of data where there were over 2,000 competitions run, and the average savings was over 30%. No matter which service it was, it didn't matter. There's a more up-to-date set of data. And what's fascinating about this, the average savings was 38% for that case, for these cases, I mean. But even when the contractor won, the government still said they could save 28%. The government in these cases with public-private competition, if you're not familiar with them, is allowed to bid not what they currently are doing, but their most effective organization. So they can streamline their organizations, and even when they lost, they cut 28%. When they won, they cut 44%. But still, the average was 38%. And what was also interesting is that even when they lost or won and had to take the cut, the average number of RIFs was 5%, reduction in force. The reason for that is that they filled other jobs, or they turned their badges over and went to work for the contractor, or they retired, because there's so many that were eligible for retirement. But I think that's kind of an interesting set of data from that respect. And then people always say, well, were the savings really realized, or was this just a buy-in? And so this was a study that was done on looking at after the fact, were the savings realized? And this is done for the Center for Naval Analysis, did this study. And where they had promised a savings of 35%, when you adjust for the same scope and quantity, the actual savings were 34%. They were realized after the competitions. Again, no matter who won, public or private. Although I have to tell you that it was a lot easier to find the data on the private sector because this was contract data. In the public sector, that data isn't kept, and what they had to do is count heads to see if they got the reductions that had been promised. Now, does it improve performance? This column, the prior to performance-based logistics, prior to, versus after competition. This last set, by the way, is a public-private partnership, and you can see the huge difference, for example, here, an order of magnitude better in response time and a significant improvement in material availability across the board. And even with the public-private partnerships, significant improvement in availability, significant reduction in response time. This is for additional example that probably everyone could easily understand. Why do you need public sector people to drive buses? And this was a set of data that Emmanuel Savin did, looking at different cities on public transportation improvements in terms of service levels. And what I should highlight is the fact that the cost savings of 20 to 60% went along with that improved performance as a result of the competition. And this was the last set of competitions. I say that because Congress decided to ignore all this data and say we're no longer allowed to have any future competitions, public-private competitions. Both of these were won by the public sector, and the savings, needless to say, were quite dramatic in both cases. Given that data, Congress decided we're going to no longer have it, obviously because the public sector union put pressure on both the White House and the Congress. Okay, so now let me shift to the public-private partnerships as I think an ideal partnership, one that can take advantage of the experience of the government workers and the competitive benefits and skills of the industry. A lot of different forms of that, and I'll give you some examples of each of these. At the research side, between government labs and universities, and service area. For example, those government depots, that's where the 50% mandated work must be done by Congress's mandate. And it's obvious why that mandate was done, because each of these depots have 20,000 people in them, or I should have said 20,000 voters. And you can clearly get competition even between public-private partners and another set of public-private partners. So there's a variety of different ways in which we can develop these public-private partnerships. There's been a variety of different approaches taken. And I'll give you examples of each of these in a minute, like in terms of the data. But you can do it with infrastructure, facilities, toll roads, things like that. You can do it with research, as I said, universities, small businesses, government labs. You can do it on programs, and I'll give you an example of that one. And then even in the logistics area, in the supply chain partnerships, and I'll give you an example of that one as well. Okay, this one happens to be the infrastructure example out here on I-95, which you all have hopefully use. This is a revenue sharing one. The state of Maryland awarded this 2-year project to look at the two houses, the Maryland House, the Chesapeake House, that I'm sure most of you have visited, converting that into a public-private partnership. The state, in this case, is retaining the ownership, and as with all of these public-private partnerships, the state still has the responsibility of oversight and management. Never taking away that management responsibility across the board. Even in the outsourced case, the public sector still has the management responsibility for it. But in this case, the private sector put up the money, the $56 million, and was given a long-term operating lease on those buildings. And the state estimates that as a result of this partnership, they're going to get $400 million in revenue. And it's a revenue sharing, so obviously the private sector expects to be getting back their money as well. This is an example of the research type activities. This is one that actually the Congress, Senator Mikulski in this case, gave a 3-year award of, I guess, about $1.7 million per year to establish these public-private partnerships between the faculty researchers at the University of Maryland and the Army Research Lab up the street. And the way this works is the same way the government does work. I was the program manager of this one, and the professors, I got like over 20 proposals each year from the professors for projects they wanted to do. And together with the Army Research Lab, so the public-private partnership here, we selected 7 of those 20 or more each year to fund at a very low level. I mean, I've forgotten, it was like 120,000 or something like that. But the whole concept was getting a small business startup and getting some venture capitalists to put in some really significant money into it. And so with those projects, the venture capitalists are attracted by the fact that the projects were selected because they were commercially useful and because they had some application for the military. So you have a guaranteed first buyer in the sense of the military, because the Army Research Lab is behind it. And that would attract the venture capitalists because they see this great idea, but weren't sure if it would really catch on. And as I said, this is, I think, a success story. I'll give you just two quick examples of this. This one happens to be flexible batteries, which is a nice thing to have if you don't want to lug around a lot of electronic equipment, which every soldier has to carry. There's something called the Land Warrior, where every soldier has not only communication equipment, but a GPS on his shoulder and a sighting device and lasers and so forth. And it takes a lot of power. But if he can just strap it to his body as flexible batteries, that's why the company is called FlexL. The university professor is the president of the company that they started up, a small startup. And they got a lot of interest, in this case from a Fortune 100 company, put up some additional money. And you can see that this was just a letter I got from the president. You can see how it was growing. And I guess you'd call it a success story then. This is another one, this Glicknick, is one in which the Army obviously is very interested in, with wounds, not having disease spreading and being able to stop the bleeding. And so you can see civilian applications of both of these that I've just went through. And in this case, a venture capitalist came in with $2 million. So the success of what was started up as a little startup with $100,000 worth of government money, and you can see how bringing in the VCs in this case really helped to make that a real company for a small startup. Now, something I should point out to you is that we tend to think that the government is the big source of research money. But this is actual data. Here's what's happening with the government. Remember I said they're cutting back on research money? This is federal expenditures on research. This is private sector expenditures on research in the US. And you can see the significant difference. So one of the things we want to do is make sure that we take full advantage of this commercial investment, and the DoD needs to learn how to buy commercial stuff, or the government needs to learn how to buy commercial stuff, because it used to be back here that lots of the innovation came from the federal government. Now, much of the innovation is coming from the private sector, and the federal government needs to take advantage of that private sector investment. The other thing that it seems to me, besides thinking of the industrial base, including the commercial firms, you want to think about it on a global basis. This is US dollars down here. Notice it's flattening out in the last few years. This is world R&D investments, commercial and military. So this US one is the sum of these two. And this is the global investments, which are going up significantly. I just took part 2 weeks ago in a conference in China on their innovation initiatives that they're starting. And everywhere people recognize that this really is driving the economic competitiveness and national security from the viewpoint of our technological leadership position that we've always felt was our differentiator for security. So clearly we want to be able to take advantage of multinational research projects. Some of you may have seen that there was a research paper that came out recently showing patents being awarded more to multinational researchers than to the US alone. And this is an example of why we could take advantage of that with this larger amount of international investments versus US investments. Okay, so I just got a real kick out of this. Literally this week, this was a headline in the Federal Times. Army seeks to expand public-private partnerships. And these are the areas that were highlighted. And you can see many of those look commercial, don't they? So you can see why I was placing emphasis on commercial areas. And I should emphasize, when I talk about innovation, I'm not talking just about products. I'm also talking about processes, including services. How can we, improve the delivery of services, not only in the private sector, but even by the government, using e-government in this case. But you can see a lot of this, certainly energy generation is private in many cases, education, dining halls, all of this. And the National Defense Authorization Act of this year gave broad latitude to prioritizing services that are not inherently governmental being done in the private sector. This is another example. I'm just going through a lot of examples now of public-private partnerships. This one happens to be in the support area. Auxiliary power unit that was done for Navy aircraft for the F-18s. This was a partnership between Honeywell and the Navy. And you can see the improvement in performance that came about. Response time dramatically improved, but cost savings, even though performance went up, costs went down. Now that's kind of what you are seeing in your personal computers. It's also what we're seeing in GPS. I mean, I actually went, my first time in the government, can't mention I was there twice, my first time there I started the GPS program. At that time, the user equipment for one airplane was going to be $150,000 each just to operate. Now you have it carrying it around in your cell phone. It's just a few bucks. I mean, it's because of the high volume, and you want to take advantage of that. And again, this is something that you can see they got higher performance at lower cost with this program. Here's another example. This one is the supply chain, a partnership between the Defense Logistics Agency and Hamilton Sundstrand. In this case, by this partnership, inventory, which is expensive to carry, was reduced 98%, and the orders were shipped within 2 days of being placed. That's not typical government response. And so they were gaining the benefits of private as well as the benefits of public. You can take advantage of both, and it's, in that case, a very successful model. All right, so let me end by saying what are the characteristics of a successful public-private partnership? Now, without going through reading you this long list, these are the things that have come out of the case studies. You know, you really want a long-term commitment, you want to have a shared vision, you certainly want good metrics, you certainly want to have the smart buyers involved, you certainly want high-level support, and on and on. You've got to be, this is a partnership, really a true partnership, not just words. And you need to make sure that they're working together in doing this. But these characteristics came out of looking at detailed numbers, of large number of these public-private partnerships. So let me end by pointing out this, I believe, is a very critical period. I was even thinking of maybe saying compared to the fall of the Berlin Wall or putting up Sputnik, or you know, you can give a lot of analogies of some critical periods. If you go back to my first chart about the environment and talking about the financial crisis that we have, the world's instability that we have, the crisis in the government workforce that we have, putting all that together, I think this is a critical period. And I would argue not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local levels for both economics and security. I mean, the two examples I gave up here on security are at the local level, the Boston bombing and the Washington Navy Yard. Now, how do we solve this challenge with reduced resources? And with the uncertainty in both how many dollars and the uncertainty in what's it for. The mission need uncertainty too. And I would think one of the things we clearly have to focus on is this smart buyers for getting our money's worth, if you will, out of it. And I think one of the best ways of doing that is through this public-private partnership, because then you're taking advantage of both sectors, the public sector and the private sector. But you want to make sure you're only doing it for the non-inherently governmental work. You've got to go back to this question of what is inherently governmental again. Okay. Kent, do you want me to take questions now, or
Yes,
you want to do it
we'll
later?
do that.
Okay.
And, I'm a little bit troubled by partnership.
Could you please use the microphone, Brian, and also introduce yourself?
Brian Cahan, MIT Center for Digital Business. I'm a little bit concerned, and you started to get at this a little bit in your last slide when you were talking about true partnership. But sort of from a legal perspective, a partnership is basically, it's a joint enterprise. A lot of this stuff looks like competitive procurement, but where there is a larger private sector role, but it's basically something that's contractual, that's competed, and there's a lot of regularities to this. When I saw your slide on the Maryland long-term partnerships for these rest areas, that's 35, 40 years. Now that looks more like a long-term partnership. I was wondering, are those competed? And
Yeah.
so the general question is, how do you call something a partnership when it's really an asymmetrical arrangement in which the state is at least calling the long-term shots?
Well, two things. One is they are competed for as contrasted to continuous awards. Some of them, they do actually have continuous competition. But of course, the big advantage of the long-term commitment in this case was that they got the private sector to put up the money. And you wouldn't do that unless you had this longer-term expected return, which is what they were looking for. And as I said, the government itself expected to get $400 million back. So the prime contractor who was running it also expected to get it back. But the government also still owned all those facilities. So if I were writing the contract, what I would do to address your point is I would say, unless you achieve the metrics we counted on each year, that we're going to recompete it. And this is a point that I think has come up a number of times. For example, when the Defense Department put out something called Better Buying Power 1.0, they said all service contracts will be recompeted every 3 years. That's a total disincentive. Unless they had said all contracts will be recompeted every 3 years unless we will recompete these, unless you get higher and higher performance at lower and lower costs. If you do, we will guarantee you another 3 years with the same clause.
Okay,
So you need the incentives, is your point, and I think you're right.
Well, actually, I was, when you were talking just now, then I was thinking that joint investment is normally one thing that distinguishes partnerships
Yes.
from an outsourcing contract.
The investment here of the government is the facilities and the land.
The investment from the private sector was critical there.
Yes. In that case, they had their money at stake. So they had an incentive to try and make it profitable and for the government to get its share back. That's the point. You have to really motivate both sides, the government and the private sector, in these public-private partnerships. And with the option of always recompeting it if it doesn't prove out, if the metrics aren't being realized. It's a good point. Other points, questions?
The lady here in the front and then the lady in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you, Dr. Gansler. That's very comprehensive. I noticed that your studies counted since the 1980s to 1990s, and some to the extent of 2004, and then a few counted to 2006. I think since 2007 till now, things has changed drastically, economically, security, and competition globally. So I don't know if you have any studies from 2007 to now, 2013. Also that the concern when we talk about government is the national security. So with recent events, incidents happening to our national securities, there are many events with civil contractors that have not shared the mutual trust, mutual risk. So there's a concern of cultural differences between government workforce and also our national security and disciplinary between the public and the private sectors. Obviously, the private sectors has to put their profits first, and the government has to put our national security and national interest first. And we've seen that, obviously, with the case of Snowden and many other cases recently within the last year. So our concern is the situation with the budget mainly is a result of sequestration, and sequestration should be resolved by the Congress. We cannot, because of that,
Right.
cut short the gap between cultural differences between the public and the private sectors. All that being said, I promote the private sector partnership. I think that's a very wise, very long-term vision. But to do that successfully, you pointed out, we need to have a key characters that is mutual trust and share risk.
Yes.
And to do that, we have to shorten the cultural gap between private sector and public sector. Thank you.
I would argue, in addition to the cultural gap, the mutual understanding is absolutely required. But let me try and get to both of your questions. The data that I was presenting there was that was dated. That was mostly on the public-private competitions, because only reason I have old data is Congress made it illegal to have new data by canceling them. Otherwise, I'd get new data, except for those 535 people. They decided that in spite of the data, that it didn't make sense to do it because of politics, pure politics in the case of the government unions there. But in the partnerships, some of that data is new. That partnership data is more current, at least, because they haven't so far outlawed those. Now, your point, though, which is very critical in terms of the partnership, what is the incentive for public good? And that's where the contract has to be written for the public-private partnership so that they're incentivized to benefit the public good with improved performance at lower cost. And if you can do that, that's where you start off, and then you use the metrics to determine if you're getting it. If you're not getting improved performance at lower cost, you stop it and you recompete it, or you bring in some other contractors. I know the statement you made about contractors only interested in profit, that the President of the United States made the same statement. I have a quote from him about that. On the other hand, if the contractor is incentivized to try to get more profit through delivering goods of the public interest, that's what you need. He'll do it at lower cost with higher performance if he'll get the follow-on contract. Only if he does those will he get the follow-on contract. That's the incentive. And now he's working with the public sector, and they're exchanging their views and learning each other's culture. Your point about culture is certainly true. The basic motivation one hopes of the public sector is improved performance at lower cost. And if the contractor is incentivized to give improved performance at lower cost, and that means higher profit, he'll do it. That's why you have to word the contract that way.
I thank you. I just one follow-up point. We have concern when we bring it into public. I mean, the governmental, military, air forces, and all that has a lot of concern with espionage, IPR. So that's where the critical roles of the private sectors, the situation that we have people in our system, and then they do have lower cost, they do have higher performance, but they also channel our informations and data into another buyer, may I say, that
No, I
can
understand
provide
what
them
you're saying,
higher price.
but
So then it's kind of critical that we consider. May I just make another point?
Well, let me address that point about espionage, because the two most prevalent ones right now, one of them wears an Army uniform, and the other one worked for the National Security Agency and then happened to work for a private contractor afterwards. The press has been highlighting the fact that he came from Booz Allen, but he really got his information and his access when he was working at NSA. And so all public sector are not necessarily going to not reveal information, especially when they get paid for it.
So it's a lot more critical, and we need to have a lot more.
We have
work.
controls, yeah.
We have controls. The other day, I just want to bring in one point. Just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, I attended an event of building better generals, hosted by the Center for New American Security. And they pointed out that the generals now need to have more knowledge, more technology knowledge, and also more of the businessman attitude of the CEO of a corporate. And I feel I feel that we have lowered the standard or expectation for our generals, from the leaders down to a technocrat. And then when we kind of put them into the same level with the CEOs, we take away the highest culture of our generals, that is putting the national interest first, second to the interest of the corporation. That's very important.
I agree with you. By pure coincidence, Congress mandated a study by the National Academy to look at the question of should the Department of Defense continue to pay for graduate degrees. I happen to be chairing that study, and it just began. I spent last week actually at Dayton, Ohio, at the Air Force Institute of Technology, where they do give master's and doctor's degrees. And it is interesting. I mean, your point is a very good one, that there's a concern that as the budget declines, that the services may cut out the funding of the master's and doctor's degrees they've been paying for. And so that's why Congress mandated the study, and I suspect there are some people who sort of incorrectly assume that you don't need this education to be a general or to be even a congressman. But that's a different question.
So the lady in the back there had a question?
But we are studying that explicitly now.
This is part of being a smart shopper. You've got to keep pace, in a sense, with this rapid technology, but for my children, I certainly couldn't do myself.
Well, the Air Force thinks that it would be smart to have a master's degree in aeronautics if you're a pilot. Makes sense to me. If I were going to be in charge of a program office, which a lot of the military are in the case of defense, wouldn't it be nice if they understood business and had a master's in business even? And why wouldn't that make sense to pay for that? You know, that's what we're looking at in this National Academy study now. Yeah, and it's in many cases it's part of the culture. They have the War College, they have the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, they have, you know, those are graduate, and they could also, the other part of the program is they send them to MIT or Harvard or Stanford to get their graduate degrees. At Maryland, we have 3 Air Force officers right now being funded by the Air Force for their masters in public policy.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Gansler. I'm Emilia, a finance student from University of Maryland, and I'm really interested in this topic. And in China, you know, sometimes the private companies are supported by the government, because sometimes private companies usually run out of resources and money, and the government has to give more support. I want to know whether in America does the government have the preference for the companies they have a partnership? And the second question is, does the private support include some international companies? Thank you.
Yes, okay, let me address both those questions, because as I said, I just spent a week in China at the National University of Defense Technology, running a conference there, and also teaching in the class there. And one of the points directly addressing your point, as you know probably, the defense firms in China are owned by the government. And I gave a talk on the benefits of competition, and one of the students actually raised his hand and said, "You make up that data?" Because he was indoctrinated to think that the government would, this is kind of the same point, the government would do what's good for the government. But the reality is, in a monopoly situation, you have perverse incentives to try and build a bigger organization and get more money so you can get promoted. And there was an objection to competition in that environment. And the reality is, based on the data, I didn't present it all today, but I have piles and piles of data, you know, in terms of what happens when you have competition continuously and how you can, in fact, get higher performance at lower cost through competition. I think there's a very real concern in China whether they have adequate amounts of competition and to gain the benefits of it. Now, your other half of your question was, does the company want this public-private partnership? And I think there's clearly an incentive here for them if it's properly worded. This goes back to the point I made earlier about the form of the contract. If it's an incentive for the company to do it, they can take advantage of the skills of the government. The government really has been doing a lot of this work that we're talking about in the public-private partnerships is work that had previously been in the public sector. And so the government workers have the skills and knowledge that the private sector can gain from when they start to go together. The difference is the private sector also has a lot of skills and knowledge, but particularly with regard to incentives and competition. And so they have to both take advantage of both sides of that when they're working together. And as long as there's an incentive for the private sector to be able to grow its business and make a profit on it, the contract, if the contract's written that way, it can be very good. Now, your last point about international companies, you know, all the companies are today basically global. I mean, in fact, even in defense, every single U.S. weapon system today has foreign parts in it because they're better. You saw the data I gave you on the investments, not because they're cheaper, but because they're better. And the sixth largest domestically located U.S. defense firm is BAE Systems, where their headquarters happen to be in London, not here. But they are the sixth largest domestically located firm here in the United States. And all the other firms, Lockheed, biggest defense contractor, will tell you they are now a global firm. A lot of the, Raytheon's making a big investment in the UK and in Europe. Each of them are working together. And when we're looking for the best in class, I'll give you a simple example of that. The largest killer of Americans and maimer of Americans are roadside bombs. So we want to protect our soldiers and Marines when they're in the vehicles driving through Iraq and Afghanistan with the roadside bombs. We looked around the world to find where is the best armor made in the world. Well, if you think about it, who has the most unfriendly neighbors? Israel, right? Okay, and where do you think the armor for the MRAP vehicles, these are the armored personnel carriers, come from? Israel. But they're being built in New Hampshire, you know? And the same thing, if we wanted the best shock absorbers for that vehicle, because it was off-road and when the bombs go off, you need shock absorbers. Germany had the best shock absorbers. The tires, France had the best design for tires. And even some of the electronics was coming from Asia in those MRAP vehicles. But the main thing is the armor, obviously protecting them. And that's coming from Israel, being made in New Hampshire. But it's their design. We want to take advantage of all that foreign investment, and U.S. companies. Now, there was an article that Bob Reich wrote in the Harvard Business Review, I remember, when he pointed out what's a foreign firm? You know, is this Israeli firm in New Hampshire a foreign firm? Is BAE Systems, the sixth largest U.S. defense firm, a foreign firm? You know, and you get into that kind of question. But let me ask you it a different way. Can any of you envision a future national security environment in which we won't be in a coalition? I can't. I think we will be in a coalition, and we need partners for that. And that's what we certainly have found in other situations recently. And if we continue to do that, then, well, for example, there are now 100 nations in the world with ballistic missiles. And if we're going to have our troops out there with German, French, British troops and ours all together, and the missiles coming in, can we afford to not have our systems be interoperable? Can we afford to pick up the phone and say, you know, Fritz, you take the first one, Pierre, you take the second one, you know, Richard, you take the third one, I'll take the fourth one? We can't do this by phone. There are only seconds left. We need an integrated air defense system, missile defense system for that case. So we should be sharing our technology, and they should be controlling it. That's a secondary condition, I agree.
So the gentleman in the back, and let's make this the last question. I want to get to our talented panel, too.
Sorry.
No, this is
Timothy Xiao from USAID. I have a question regarding the regarding dual use technology
Yes.
and public-private partnerships. So, because private company, when they enter into contract with DoD, sometimes they're subjected to different limitations in terms of what they can do to sell their product overseas to countries like China, or to subcontract their parts to countries like China. So, would you comment about any advice from you for the Congress to fine-tune our legislation so that we can both take advantage of the innovation power from the private sector as well as protecting our national security? Thank you.
That's a very important point. We are actually harming our firms in the United States and our employment because of the rules that we've set up. I'll give you some examples, easy to understand. Boeing used to build commercial and military transports. And you know, these are the things you and I fly in are the commercial ones. And then their military ones are very similar ones that have some special requirements that are military. But in terms of basic construction and so forth, they were building both of them in Wichita until the application of specialized cost accounting rules, which said that the independent research being invested for the military side must be allocated on the basis of sales out of that facility. So that made the commercial airplanes cost more because they were allocating the independent research they were doing on the military side to the commercial ones. And so what Boeing did was to say, well, we'll set up our commercial plant in California instead of in Wichita. And that's what they did. That forced the military plane costs to go up, because they no longer had the economies of scale from the combined production of the two systems. And it really makes sense to have civil and military together, not just for economies of scale, but for technology transfer. I showed you the data of how much the commercial world is investing compared to the government investments. Take advantage of both ways. The commercial world benefiting from military investments, which happens all the time in terms of, I gave you the internet as an example, but it's jet engines or aircraft and whatever you pick. And electronics certainly, and a lot of software investments and so forth are coming out of the DoD to the commercial world, but it goes the other way too. The commercial investments are being taken advantage of by the government, hopefully. But with these barriers that you're pointing out that Congress has created in many cases, one of them being the cost accounting standards, another one is export controls. You want a ridiculous example? Some of you may be familiar with the Roomba vacuum cleaner, the one that runs around on the floor, the little round circle that avoids tables and chairs because it knows where it's going and it knows where it's been. So the Department of Defense said you can't export that, literally. And they're controlling the export of the vacuum cleaner because the navigation software in that program is on the export control list. So the answer is look at the export control list, revise it, apply logic, instead of just blanket rules to things of that sort. And there are other examples that I could go through, a long list of things, but the primary two are export controls and the cost accounting standards. I'll give you another example. Boeing had to pay $15 million when they exported a commercial 767 because there was a little chip in the electronics that's also in the Maverick missile. And it was decided by somebody that was a violation of export controls. So to export a commercial airliner, Boeing had to pay $15 million for that case in order to just get over this one little chip that was in both systems. And again, it's just logic is bothering me when we put on some of these rather foolish rules. But there's also some sensible concerns, about counterfeit parts and about third-party exports and things like that we have to worry about and control working with our allies and partners. It's not like you should ignore it. You certainly have to address it. But if you're worrying about counterfeit parts, you test all the parts. If you're worrying about third-party exports, you arrange deals with them. And a lot of the current problems, like cybersecurity, are going to be solved not just with hard power, but soft power. We're going to have to work together with State Department and Defense Department on this international stuff. Like cybersecurity, we have to get other countries to agree that they will prosecute their violators as we should prosecute our violators.
Jack, thank you very much. This has been not only an education on public-private partnerships, but put in a global context, which is where we're going to be for the rest of this
The
century.
world is globalized. Labor is globalized. Industry is globalized. Technology is globalized. We have no
Brought back
choice.
some, having worked on export controls myself, you brought back some painful memories.
Sorry.
Please, another round of applause really for an outstanding presentation. May I ask our talented panel to please join me on the stage here. To be as diplomatic as possible, I'm going to fall back on introducing the panel in alphabetical order. To my immediate left, your immediate right, we have Steve Campbell, who's an economist in the Economic Analysis Office at the National Institute for Standards and Technology. The Analysis Office provides economic, technology assessment, and strategic planning experience for NIST. Earlier, Steve served as the group leader for the Advanced Technology Program and the Technology Innovation Program, which are two of the reasons why I'm really anxious to have him here on the panel. He has a strong background in economics and, in fact, teaches economics and statistics at Catholic University. To his immediate left is Sue Gander, who directs the Environment, Energy, and Transportation Division of the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. And at that center, she leads a team that provides state policy guidance and some technical assistance as well. She's led NGA chairs, and that means she worked closely with key governors, for Governor Pawlenty on clean energy and Governor Rendell on infrastructure. Prior to joining the NGA, Sue was a program manager on clean energy and environment at EPA, and that also involved state partnerships. She has a BA in public policy from Brown and an MA in public policy from Wisconsin, so she's well-versed in public policy. And to her left, an old friend, Sujay Shivakumar, who's the Deputy Director of the Board on Science, Technology, and Economic Policy at the National Academies. This is a group that does all kinds of look at innovation systems around the world, as well as technology programs here in the United States. He's been the academics researcher involving public-private technology partnerships, including a major review of the SBIR program, one of the leading government efforts in a public-private partnership to stimulate innovation. His reach really extends to innovation systems around the world as we enter the kind of global world that Jack talked about, one in which we have a lot to offer the world, and we also have a lot to learn from the world, and he really has done both. There's an awful lot of economics up here, and as you know, economists have become, next to lawyers, the most reviled profession in Washington, and I fit in that position myself. So I will go ahead nonetheless and say that Sujay has a doctorate in economics from George Mason University. Steve, let me start with you, and if you could give us that background on the advanced technology. Oh, you need to have the clicker, right?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think I'm a later addition to the panel, so I have to tell you that when I first read and saw the title, two immediate things popped into my head. One was, what's the over-under on how many minutes it'll take till someone points out healthcare.gov was a public-private partnership? I lost that bet with myself. I thought Kent would knock that one out in about 4 seconds, so I'll be the first to point that out. The second thought I had was kind of what Brian was getting at, and the question is, I don't even know if we all agree on what we mean a partnership is. Is this a boundaries of the firm problem where we figure out what do I insource, what do I outsource? Does it mean only strong, legalistic, clear, contractual things, or do squishy collaborations where we share information count as a partnership? So thankfully I could just punt on that more difficult question, say I'll just stick to the program that I was involved in and try to make the case that there are lessons from a 17-year run of the Advanced Technology Program as a public-private partnership that can shed some light in general about broader public-private partnership programs that are likely to come up. Okay, so ATP was formed in 1990. Like all good organizations, it'll have a mission statement. And right in there is broad national benefit through partnerships with the private sector. So ATP was formed and designed as a public-private partnership long before that word was cool to use. So that was nice. There were lots of, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of what ATP did, the Advanced Technology Program, but there's some of the key characteristics that you can read. But I guess I'd focus only here on the first bullet, which kind of gets at the nature of the partnership. I mean, how are we partnering? The public part, our partnership involved money, expertise on selecting the projects, project management of watching these 3 to 5 year projects, and if they started to go off the rails, turn off the spigot, and then evaluation on the back end. What kind of return did we get for our investment as taxpayers? The private part of the partnership, what the private sector brought to the table was a little money. They had to cost share a little bit, although not as much. They brought solely the R&D direction. At least in ATP, we didn't say, you need to find a solution for X, Y, Z. Company said, we think solutions need to be found in X, Y, Z, and then we would select which ones made the strongest case. And the commercial pathway is solely up to the private sector. At least in ATP, the government had nothing to say about, we think we should sell here or there or which applications. So the roles were very clear in terms of that partnership, but that needn't always be the case. So I should have put the word transferable in quotes here because it's not clear to me that everything is transferable. I hope it's transferable, some of these, but maybe some, maybe all of the lessons that I'm learning from ATP, and they're going to fall in 3 categories. Just want to leave you with kind of 3 points. One, the importance of defining the rationale for the partnership, which given that ATP is no longer a program, I don't think we did it very well. Well, I thought we did, but the proof's in the pudding. No one, in the end, they didn't buy the argument. And I think there's a lot can be learned from these smaller, like joint venture collaborations that speak to the implications of broader public-private partnerships. And I'll try to make the case that structure matters of these things. And again, unlike the broader public-private partnership we just heard, I'd say this is a little more tailored and focused to things that are more R&D related. And the slide you had about R&D, I saw that one was percent, where at least at NIST, when I was with the program, we would get hung up a lot on the R versus the D, right? We're not about the D in this program. We're about, the R and perhaps that little wiggle room between the R and the D. So the first one is, there's got to be a rationale for that partnership up front. There has to be. In the end, it has the word public in there, right? My fear and my sense was when we use the term public-private partnership, we make sure we throw that private word in there because it serves as a wonderful deodorant to the word public hanging around. And we're afraid to make the case that, no, that there is a reasonable and rational public element here, and we don't need private just to try to mask that. We can go ahead and emphasize that. The rationale for ATP, the director of the program would often talk about the valley of death, this notion of young technologies not getting VC funding, or the Darwinian sea, there's all this churning and you never know which innovations. And he would always joke with me and say, I like bullet number 1. Bullet number 2 is just economist gobbledygook. And to me, it was just reversed, right? There's an economist, I know what 2 means. I don't know what squishy things like Valley of Death and Darwinian Sea mean, other than you have nice pictures to go with them. So the economics case of it was there are inefficiencies in what the private market deals in terms of early stage capital technology funding. There's information asymmetries. Some companies know what works, others don't work. We don't know. We can't extract the right information. There's very high technical risk. Companies are reluctant to look too far out or push the envelope too much because they can't guarantee the return on the investment. And when you're dealing with early stage enabling technologies and you do the hard work up front, it's hard in economist language to appropriate that or make sure you get enough of the reward as these things move forward to justify the upfront R&D expense. So it is good when you make the public case to have the private people agree with you. And at least, ATP had that. People from 3D said, yeah, we need things like this. Large companies need this as well for some projects that they may not consider moving forward in their own portfolio because of those things that we talked about in the previous slide. The VC market said, look, there are just some areas we're not going to touch because we don't think the money's there immediately, and we'll let you get through the hard technical stuff, and then we're happy to put our money in there. Won't spend too much time here other than to make the case that ATP was at this for a long time, right? 17 years of more than 7,000 proposals. They funded 824 projects, lots of joint ventures and single companies. Even the single companies were very collaborative, right? And like many programs, we were forced to do different programmatic evaluations to say what kind of return are we getting for our money. That last bullet, it's cherry picking. There's no doubt about it. But we found 36 highly successful projects, and when you survey and interview those companies and say what revenues or cost savings can you attribute to what we paid for, their aggregate number more than paid for the entire history of the program. So unless the other 824 minus 36 delivered negative outcomes, we got a positive return on our investment. So point number 2 was, what can we learn from kind of these micro or lower level research joint ventures that can tell us something about the broader public-private partnership space? So one thing we did at the program was there were several hundred research joint ventures. So we went out and we surveyed and collected data from all of them. And we matched that also up with publication data and patenting data and all sorts of other survey question data. And we were trying to get at, what makes a good partnership work. Forget public-private. As the private actors, what is it about a partnership that is effective? And then you can translate that to a public-private partnership as well. One of the hypotheses of the survey and to do the work was, when you have competitors running around with each other, is that a problem? Now, this study found it's no problem in terms of outcomes of who's commercializing, who's patenting, who's doing follow-on R&D. Part of that is that there's a selection issue here, is when they applied for funding, if there were competitors, they had to make a strong case that this isn't going to be a problem. And we think more broadly about public-private partnerships. If you expand your circle, is it a problem where the private end has two competing things? Well, no, if you have good selection criteria and you have some sense of what this partnership is supposed to deliver. I think the next two shouldn't be surprising to anybody. When you can build in governance structure that helps with levels of trust among all partners, that's associated and correlated with higher rates of success of these research joint ventures. Use the Reagan term, trust but verify. Yeah, it does work. Frequency of communication, these are positively correlated with all the successful outcomes of the research joint ventures. Skip to the last one, a champion matters. In the research joint venture, someone who's there to drive that goal over and over, it matters. And I think it matters in the public-private partnership in the broader sense, and it needn't be that the private player is the champion. Yeah, it can be, but maybe the government can be the champion, but you need that champion for sustaining. The next to last bullet, this was not just true for research joint ventures, but the economic analysis we did for every ATP project is ambitiousness is positively correlated with success. And not in terms of rate, but if you have ambitious goals, when it works, it's much more effective. In fact, so, you know, the bad joke I would make was if you shoot for Mars, you might get the moon, right? If you shoot for the moon, you'll get Cleveland. Now, I'm from near Pittsburgh, so that's funny. If you're from Cleveland, I'm sorry, right? But it's, so it seems counterintuitive, and not just on, you get that bigger hit, but even more frequency. It was much more frequency when that higher level ambitiousness, and we measured that through asking all the companies, what's the probabilistic technical risk here that you can't pull this off? The more ambitious it was, the more it was a new direction for them, the more successful these joint ventures were doing. It may speak to that grand challenge helps establish these champions and other things like that. If these kind of things interest you, that's where a lot of those findings came from. We have a whole litany of things. You can access that website. I think is still up, even though the program is not still up. Okay, and the final point I make is when we think about these partnerships, not as we first discussed the kind of boundary of the firms, who's paying for what, but in the partnership in general, who pays for this, right? And to what extent does the mix of the public funds versus the private funds matter? And can cost sharing give you different? And there's this notion of in partnership, I guess the intuition is skin in the game, right? If you have skin in the game, you're more committed, which is why I do like that quote. You know, the difference between involvement and commitment is like eggs and ham. The chicken was involved, the pig was committed. So there's notion of if you have skin in the game, you're going to care, and that should drive higher and better outcomes. Right, so the study that actually I did was I looked at joint ventures had to pony up cost share. Single company projects did not. But they could voluntarily say, I'm going to kick in more cost share to this. And about half of the awardees did that, usually as a signal to the selection committee, hey, I'm serious, right? I have skin in the game. So the research question was, okay, if I look at those people that put their money where their mouth is, added skin in the game, versus those that said, I'll just take your money and add my little bit that I'm required to by law, are the skin in the game people drastically outperforming the non-skin in the game people? And it turns out no. And I think that may be important in these public-private, at least for ATP to the extent that it's transferable. Right? Whether you put up any additional money or the intensity, you put up a big chunk of the coal cost share, it was not correlated statistically with any of the project outcomes we were interested in. You weren't better at publications, patenting, commercialization, finding continued R&D funding after our funding ended. It wasn't correlated on the good side. People that put their more skin in the game, they weren't backing off on the ambitiousness or the risk, or they weren't shrinking the time horizon. So that's a good thing. You know, they weren't, so it is one good takeaway that if you make people put skin in the game, it doesn't mean they're going to back off on the challenge that they can present to you. Yeah, in some of these statistical regressions, the more you ponied up in cost share, the less willing you were to pursue completely new R&D directions. So if your public-private partnership is all about pushing the envelope in new areas that make firms uncomfortable, you may want to think about how you structure that cost share and have the government, the public side, step up a little more to say, we'll underwrite the finance more of that. Then if it's something that's just pushing in a direction that companies are already familiar with, but let's see how much we can do better, then maybe it makes sense to go ahead and let them absorb more of that cost. And the last one that I found most interesting is there was only one positive correlation that these higher cost share people turned out. And it was they stopped their projects earlier, right? So the existence of additional private money, although it may not get you better project results, it does get you, I would argue, faster decisions, right? If you're going to rely on the government funding, you're going to be much more patient, right? And say, well, it's not my dime, let's give it another year. Right? If it is more of your money, my argument is you're going to make that decision quicker, and it's not clear to me that's a bad thing from the public side, right? The remaining analysis I'm kind of playing with, but it's hard to tease out, is The danger with that last point is if your real innovation hits occur at the end of projects, then it's a problem, right? That you're turning that off too fast. But there really isn't, in my mind, very strong evidence that the real home runs are happening right at the last mile marker, right? You kind of have, these are smart people. They kind of can see the writing on the wall. And if in these tight budget constraints we're talking about, ponying up money on the private side, okay. Don't expect necessarily better outcomes, but you're certainly going to get better and faster decision making, which should free up some money. So if you have any other, I'm happy to chat always about anything. Send me an email, and there's the phone number, and thanks for your time.
That's great. Thank you, Sue. Sue, please.
Do you want us to stay up here, or am I'm afraid I'm going to block.
Oh, yeah.
So-
you
We
can
can
sit
just
in my seat.
Okay. Well,
Great,
should
I'll
we
go ahead
back?
and get started as the slides are being pulled up. Great to be with you this afternoon. I'm gonna try to do just a quick overview of what we're seeing in terms of the use of public-private partnerships at the state level, focusing on infrastructure. And then I'm gonna I have a few thoughts on the question of what this means for small businesses and for innovation. And I have to admit, what I'm going to say is really based on a lot of anecdotal kind of information. There have been, I've been part of a lot of conversations on that. There's not a lot of data about that, but I'll share with you where we're at right now. Excellent. So quickly about NGA, as Kent mentioned, I'm at our Center for Best Practices, and our job is to look at state policy making and share best practices among the governors and among the states. So we do a lot of surveying of what's going on at the state level. We also look internationally, particularly in this issue of public-private partnerships, and try to share that information among the states. And we are working intently on the issue of infrastructure. It is a key issue for the governors. We've recently created a state resource center on innovative infrastructure strategies. We're launching our first effort under that. Actually, right now, we have our own RFP out on the streets. Applications due today for a series of, or a set of state policy retreats we'll be holding on public-private partnerships, looking to work with about 5 states there. So we've done a lot of workshops and a lot of webinars. This is going to be a more deeper dive helping states in this area. And the reason is because, as many of you know, we have a real infrastructure, I'd say imperative. I don't want to say crisis. Everybody kind of freaks out with that word. But we have a D+. It's actually higher than it has been in past years, a D+ on the annual report card that the civil engineers do every year about America's infrastructure. We have, lots of examples of infrastructure failing us up there in Washington for the obsolete bridge design that led to the crash there, or the crash and then the bridge collapse there. And then I think another important issue and something that's getting a lot of resonance with governors in particular is the issues around increased extreme weather and the impact that has on our infrastructure and the issues of resiliency. And so that's kind of tied into this issue as well. Kent mentioned, and I guess Jack mentioned as well, this is partly driven by a huge revenue shortage, and this is an illustration of what that means in terms of transportation. This is the gap between the Federal Highway Trust Fund and the need every year. We've had Congress already bail that out to the tune of $55 billion. It's due to run out of funds fairly shortly, and it's causing a lot of consternation among the states because a decent percentage, over a quarter, not everything, of their transportation funding revenue comes from that. Now, one of the reasons that there is this gap is because we have more efficient vehicles, which is a good thing, and so the transfer into the fund isn't as great in terms of that, and you have some decrease in vehicle miles traveled, which again can be a good thing if folks are taking are being more efficient with their transportation choices. But again, it's just a source of challenge. States are, I want to emphasize, looking at multiple forms of revenues, and I'll talk a little bit about how we like to emphasize that looking at public-private partnerships are not about a substitution for revenues. You need a revenue source always to fund your infrastructure, but states are looking at a multitude of ways. This is transportation. Just in the last legislative session, we had a number of states actually pass new gas taxes, including, I always like to point out, Wyoming, which increased their gas tax quite significantly, but a lot of other different approaches to that as well. And they're also looking at different financing approaches. We have a pretty, for the time being, healthy municipal bond market that supports a lot of the transportation and other infrastructure investments, something a lot of other countries actually don't have. A lot of other bonding approaches and infrastructure banks. And I put public-private partnerships on this list, although kind of reluctantly, because it's much more than a financing option, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So this is the definition we use on public-private partnerships. It is one of those terms that is often defined very differently by different folks, but we like to emphasize that it's about developing a performance-based long-term approach for procuring public infrastructure, and it's about having the private sector assume some of the responsibilities, but really trying to have that balance between where are the strengths of the public sector, where are the strengths of the private sector, how can you best marry those up, and how can you best allocate the risk to the entity that can best control that risk. This is just an illustration of how there's sort of a range of relationships in terms of the contractual agreement that might come between the public and private sector. And in the middle there is kind of the sweeter spot in terms of public-private partnerships. I guess I'll just point out more easily to define that is what it's sort of not. On the public side, you have a pure public procurement situation. On the right-hand side is the privatization or divestiture of assets, and public-private partnerships fall generally, within that. You're starting to see more and more of a move from what might be a now more typical design-build kind of relationship to something that's much more extensive that will involve both operating and maintaining a facility for a long period of time. This chart shows, I don't know if you can really read it, but meant to illustrate that I'm talking a lot about transportation. That's how PPPs have been used a lot, at least at the state level. In the US, but globally they're used routinely across a number of different infrastructure sectors, and you are starting to see states show interest in those other transportation sectors, which include a lot of things that involve public buildings, as well as things like water, wastewater, and a whole host of activities. I couldn't talk about PPPs without showing this chart because it's just the essence of the sort of rationale behind any use of a PPP, which is the notion of finding value for money. And this chart, which comes from the Federal Highways Administration Office of Innovative Program Delivery, which is their entity that works on PPPs, illustrates on the left-hand side what we call a public sector comparator. That tries to illustrate what would be the cost of doing this in a public way, cost of building a new highway, let's say, in a public way, including some of the financing, the public costs, and the risks that are assumed then on the private sector. And on the right-hand side is what we call a shadow bid. Sometimes there's actually some that might be an estimate. There may be some actual data that's brought in to illustrate what then would the private sector be able to produce. And often what you see is that the base cost, or ideally, I guess, this is one scenario that works out well, you would have a base cost that might be lower. Part of that might be because they are bringing in maybe a new approach to the design or the engineering of a project. Financing is often higher, so that's the point about financing, because you're going out to the private market, so that can be higher, but you'll see that higher cost is offset by this lower base cost and lower amount of the retained risk that the public must follow. And so, you know, states, when they're going through and evaluating what they might do, what projects they might use a PPP for, are going to be doing these value for money analyses and looking for that delta to see if that's sufficient for encouraging them to go forward with a project. One thing I want to emphasize is that when we work with states and talk to them about this, we definitely emphasize that this is one tool in the toolbox. It has a lot of advantages. You've heard a lot about them. And you know, they do work well and can work well for multiple applications, but they do have a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things that states need to be aware of in terms of the arrangements. They are complex. They do take often a lot of time to put together the contracts, and they're usually fairly unique, and so each one kind of requires a lot of learning and not always the capacity at the state level to put together those kind of contracts. And they can be really difficult to explain as well. And as you heard from the example about resistance from unions, there is resistance from potentially a lot of different players. And so, you know, there's a lot that needs to go into thinking about whether or not it's the right fit or not. I'm just going to speed through about the next 10 slides because I want to get to the end where I talk about the innovation and the entrepreneurship. But there is a lot of data there internationally about how these things can work really well. Infrastructure Ontario, Partnerships BC, a lot of activity in Canada that has demonstrated improved time and performance, as was noted, as well as lower cost. So you can go back and look at the slides about what's happened there. This is an illustration from Infrastructure UK, which has had a longstanding program around public-private partnerships, their PFI program. The bars just show that they're on time, on budget, much better than conventional procurement approaches. US, as I said, not as active, a lot lower level of activity in that, but it's actually starting to increase a bit over the last couple of years in particular. This is the map that shows which states have authorized transportation-related PPPs of one form or another. And then I note down there at the bottom list of states that have that authorized for social infrastructure as well. List of activities of let's see, this is what is actually in operation. I think just something that will come up later. Big dollars here generally, but a few with some smaller dollars associated with them. Some things that have not made it well, that were not planned out wisely, I would say, by maybe both the public, but certainly the private sector as well, in terms of estimating, in many cases, what kind of toll revenue is coming in. And there's some new projects underway as well, again, transportation. Some early examples that are just worth noting, things started up to rev up in the US when the Indiana Toll Road was turned into a PPP. Then there started to be an appreciation for a newer model, not involving tolls. This has been implemented for the first time with a project in Miami, where they're going to be using what's called availability payments, so payments over time to the entity. And I'm just going to skip through here and come back to that. So just real quickly, try to think about PPPs in small businesses. There are a number of challenges. A lot of them involve around size, complex arrangements, and so often only approached or considered for projects that would be, $100 million or even, much greater than that. That's kind of a threshold a lot of people throw out. There is a lot more activity that's been done outside the U.S. So a lot of times who's coming in to look at the projects, because they have the experience, are companies from outside, so not the small U.S. businesses. And they do involve contracts that are fairly complex, multifunction, and it's expensive to put these bids together and be involved in them, and it takes time to negotiate them. So there's definitely some challenges there for sure. In terms of opportunities, there is a school of thought, and I think there's some evidence that points to the opportunities for smaller PPP arrangements. I think that's particularly true when you're looking at social infrastructure. You see that with a number of the schools and the hospitals, things that Canada has taken on in particular things that are of just a smaller dollar value, so easier for smaller companies to take on. Anytime you have a contract, even the primes need folks, on the ground doing the work. So another argument that gets put out in terms of how to think about the role of small businesses. And then additionally, oftentimes a PPP might be applied to a project that just has been stuck for a while. And so it's put out in part to the private sector to try to get some of the expertise brought into that and help to unstick and sort of, raise the level of activity overall. PPPs and innovation. I think a couple things that I would observe here, I guess, is that there is the opportunity, and in fact, PPPs are kind of driven off this notion that you're taking the public sector and you're trying to enhance it with some private sector innovation, and that it's just a better fit that way to encourage that and have the private sector take some of the risks in terms of the innovation. So a nice example of this with a nice picture, I think, on the right is what happened in the Port of Miami, where they had a very complicated project trying to tunnel under, as the final plans led to, quite urban area, trying to prepare for increased truck traffic associated with the Panama Canal expansion, and ended up designing the first of its kind tunnel boring machine. They nicknamed it Harriet, after Harriet Tubman, in terms of the tunneling, which is kind of a fun fact. Ended up having, a very innovative tool put to use here. There's other examples I think you can look to in terms of design, particularly where a PPP is looking at having the private sector be in charge of operations and management of a facility over a long period of time, because they're also associated with the design. That encourages them to look at what products they're using up front, because they're the folks that have to maintain those products, those materials over the life of the facility. One example from that is a project that's underway right now, a bridge, actually 2 bridges over the Ohio River. One where Indiana is the lead, and they are using a PPP. One from Kentucky side where they're not using a PPP. So that's another whole sidebar conversation on that. But the story from at least the Indiana side is that because of this long-term nature, the design is including a lot of materials that are specifically designed to be more weather resistant, be more robust, some things that maybe would not have come into play had that not been the arrangement. And then finally, in terms of project delivery, this notion that you can use milestones and incentives to keep performance at a certain level. This picture on the right is of the first social infrastructure project in the United States, Long Beach Courthouse, which has built into the contract provisions whereby if the contractor's not performing whatever functions they want it to perform, there's an ability to deduct from the payments. And so that's another kind of project delivery kind of incentive that folks are attracted to. So I am going to stop there and say thank you, and happy to take questions, I guess, after the next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Sue, very
Thank you.
much. Sujay.
So, start with President Lincoln. I think Kent mentioned that the Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson, and I guess in the same vein, one could think of the National Academies as sort of being a living memorial to President Lincoln. 1863, I think, was in the middle of the Civil War. I think it's the same year as the Battle of Gettysburg and some other very pivotal battles in the Civil War. And in the midst of all that, he signed the charter for the National Academies. And we are now celebrating our 150th year. And for over 20 of those years, the Board on Science, Technology, and Economic Policy has been working on innovation. The joke is that, there's an old country and western song that says that we were country before country was cool. Well, we've been doing innovation before innovation became the hot topic in Washington and elsewhere. I just wanted to show you some of the work that we've been doing in the area of partnerships. The first study, which was underway when I joined the academies about 12 years ago, was a study led by Gordon Moore of the Moore's Law fame on government-industry partnerships for the development of new technologies. This was then followed by the assessment of the SBIR program, which Dr. Gansler has graciously chaired now for the past 10 years or so. And then most recently, we just completed a study of the MEP program at NIST, which looked at the performance of MEP and its role in on providing information and improving the innovativeness of small businesses, small manufacturing businesses across the country. Also looking at what other countries are doing in this space. You have, the German Fraunhofer Institutes, ITRI in Taiwan, and so forth. So what are public-private partnerships? Well, a number of the speakers today have touched on this. These are the list of suspects is well known, and as Stephen and others have pointed out, the definitions are not tight. In many respects, this is a collective activity, a partnership, and depending on the type of partnership, the type of technology involved, the type of participants involved, the nature of the collective action problem varies, and so you have the technology for the public-private partnership then has to fit the nature of the collective action problem that you're facing. But again, as several participants have pointed out, these partnerships do have certain, they share certain characteristics. They often are based, there's industry-led. They have clear goals, metrics, and roadmaps, and in some cases roadmaps. Skin in the game has been mentioned in terms of shared commitments and costs. And there's regular internal and external assessment followed up by learning and adaptation of the partnership model. These are the Moore study that we undertook looked at these 4 major types of partnership mechanisms: innovation awards, including ATP and the SBIR program. I heard some mild disparagement of Cleveland, but there's actually a very interesting public-private university industry partnership underway there between Timken and the University of Akron, where Timken has transferred its laboratory to the University of Akron, and it's a very interesting ongoing current model that's underway. Science and technology parks, of course, and then research consortia like Sematech and some others. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the role of innovation awards. This is something that Stephen again pointed out earlier. There's a sort of a strong myth that if it's a good idea, the market will fund it. Of course, what we economists call asymmetric information is pervasive, and what that means in practical terms is, of course, that potential investors have less than perfect knowledge, especially about new ideas. And this is no less true of the venture capital markets, and venture capital markets also in the past few years have moved towards later and less risky stages of technology development, and you can sort of see this here. This is the U.S. venture capital market pie, and only 3% or less than about $750 million is invested by venture capital in seed stage development. So this is the infamous valley of death. In some respects, it's a bit cartoonish, I agree, but the truth is that we've actually been selling this particular cartoon across town for about a dozen years or so, and we've actually moved the needle, because previously people would ask, what is the value of death? And now people know what the value of death is. It's basically, you have federal funded research to create new ideas. On one side, these ideas have difficulty attracting support, so what do you need? Capital, and you need that to bridge over this valley of death to innovation, product development, and growth, of course. But now we have enough people talking about the valley of death that we can actually talk about what we can do about the valley of death. So the question is, how do innovative small firms cross the valley of death? Well, the SBIR program, we've learned over enormous amounts of study and research, is actually a proven path. This is sort of a quick, SBIR 101 for those who may not be familiar. On the left is the 140 or so billion dollars that the federal government invests in R&D over the course of, in recent terms, of course, it's reduced these days because of the sequester and so forth. But this is sort of the lower end of the graph that Jacques Gansler had pointed out earlier. You have a two-phase, basically the first phase is the feasibility research with about $150,000 granted through a competitive process. Of those, again, you have a phase 2, which is research to a prototype, and of those of those submissions that were submitted for the phase 1, there's a smaller percentage that are given a $1 million grant to pursue the prototype, and if its prototype is successful, then the assumption is that the private sector will invest in it, or in some cases the government will procure the technology, as is the case at DoD and NASA particularly. This is some of the best practice features that we found of the SBIR program. First of all, it focuses on the valley of death. It's not a sort of a general purpose or blunt policy tool like an R&D tax credit. It actually focuses on this particular collective action problem that you have in this case, the asymmetric information that we find. It's a decentralized and flexible system. It's competitive, and we found that there was really no program capture. Again, after nearly 20 years of operation, we were asked by Congress, how well is the SBIR program working? And as a result of our surveys, we found some of this data. It helps create companies. 20% of those companies said that they were founded as a result of the prospective SBIR award. The SBIR awards are prompting research to be initiated. It's helping companies grow. And the SBIR is also stimulating partnership between business and private businesses and universities. This is, I talked about the asymmetric information. Well, this is how SBIR is actually working. You find that the SBIR award itself is a symbol of quality that attracts angel investors, venture funding, in some cases acquisition, and for the DoD, it's a source of providing greater choice and validation for the technology that it's procuring. The SBIR also generates new knowledge in terms of patents and publications, this is something that we didn't expect, but we actually found that SBIR is quite effective in linking universities with industry, directly cause is not something that the National Academies likes to say very casually, but we actually did find this. It actually lowers the risks and lowers the overhead for professors to start new firms. Just in conclusion, this is how the SBIR success can be mapped out in terms of employment, in terms of creating new products, patents, licenses, in addressing the government's mission needs, and in terms of the market success of companies in the market. So this is the bumper sticker finding from our study. It's sound in concept and effective in practice. We found that it's a proven policy tool in accelerating innovation. And this is some of the sweat and tears that Dr. Gansler and some of us have toiled to produce, a whole slew of reports. And just a quick final note on the impact that our study had. I think it's mainstreamed the SBIR program. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that this study has done is actually advance the conversation. We're now talking about the valley of death, and not what it is, but how to deal with it. And in some cases, we have also improved the perception of SBIR, not as a set aside, but actually as a valuable tool for innovation. We've had a sizable impact on the reauthorization. We were told by some of the staff members up on the Hill that they'd actually tabbed and made a matrix of our recommendations, and they were following through on them point by point. As a result of this study, the program was extended for a long period until 2017, and we were able to increase the award sizes to match the erosion in inflation over the many years since the program was initially conceived, and again, provided a strong affirmation for the need of the program and for the reauthorization effort. And with that, thank you very much.
It's been a very stimulating day, and we actually are past our witching hour, but I want to save a little time for questions. Who would like to take the, I have to confess, I have a page and a half of questions myself, but I'm putting those aside to open the floor for your questions. Well, let me ask the panel, and maybe I'll take the advantage of being the chair. You've each had a different perspective on innovation and the support for small businesses, as well as the role of public-private partnerships. If you were to think of 3 things that would improve not only innovation, but the role of public-private partnerships in supporting that innovation, what might they be? Maybe the top item from each of your lists. Let's start with you, Steve.
Sure you don't want to start on the other end? Do I have to click this or it's on?
No.
I guess I'd first start with, at the end we saw the bumper sticker for SBIR. And my first thought was, we got a similar bumper sticker for ATP. The NAS did a nice study and found it was effective and well run. And that securely put our neck right on the chopping block. So the first suggestion would be is, keep working the problem of evidence-based things matter. And I think we are getting better about that. I'm not speaking for NIST. This is solely me.
No, this is all.
Okay. So 2 of my hobby horses are, one is, I think we should intentionally experiment when we have these different programs to set up upfront in a designed experimental way different structures. Let's try a little more cost share here. Let's try small end universities here. Let's try small and large here. Let's be thoughtful up front. Think about a design we experiment run. Let them go, collect some data, see what we learned, and then better in the future allocate it. So I'm all about intentionally looking for failures and figuring out what it is I want to probe on a policy perspective, and let's run the experiment. One of the hardest challenges I think we all have is it's hard to do evaluation when you don't have somewhat randomized, somewhat experimental things up front. Certainly was a problem for ATP and the SBIR. I'm sure they heard criticisms too of, well, yeah, these things are working because you're cherry picking the good ones. It would have happened in the absence of SBIR. I don't happen to buy it, but having these controls up front would be another. The final one that I guess I've been thinking about for quite a time, especially in innovation, I'd like to see, even though I'm an economist, more behavioral economists and cognitive psychologists brought into this discussion. Because I think when it comes to broader decision making, we have, as humans, have some weird biases about how we make decisions and about how we decide which directions we're going to go. I want to get that community involved. Again, they're much more experimental. Say, are there different ways we can structure the decision-making process of how you structure them, how you fund them, and let's play in different areas and let the proof be in the outcomes. So those
Very
are the
provocative thoughts. Sue, you're on the hot seat now.
Sure. Well, I'll answer maybe a little more narrowly from the types of PPPs I've been taking a look at, and say, I guess, overall, I think I tried to make the point that I think public-private partnerships, by their very nature, encourage innovation. So I guess you could say being more open to public-private partnerships would therefore help increase that as well, help increase various forms of innovation. And maybe one specific thing would be something that a number of states come down differently upon is whether or not to utilize what's known as unsolicited proposals when they're putting together projects. Some states do not use those. They want to come up with what projects they're going to target and maybe even spec out some of the details. But other states kind of throw it open and invite the private sector to make suggestions. We can go through pros and cons on both of those, but I do think that the unsolicited, lends itself to getting ideas, kind of new ideas, fresh ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, 3 points. I guess the first would be to, as I mentioned, part of our SBIR study, our task was to go out and educate the policy community. If SBIR works, but we need anecdotes very often and success stories, and I think there was a number of success stories that from SBIR. From one of the very interesting cases, for example, was this LASIK, which some of us may have had surgeries on our eyes, but very few know that it is actually a NASA SBIR where they were trying to get the docking station to match up with the space station, and it's not stable. It's sort of moving slightly, just like your eye does. And so they needed a way of tracking the movement of the space station so that it could dock perfectly. And the same technology was then used. So these kinds of really interesting anecdotes capture the public imagination and help provide support for the program. We also, in terms of the public education, we also need to emphasize compared to what. So it's not an exact comparator, but if you look at the venture capital market, they succeed once in 10 shots. And SBIR only succeeds twice in 20. So that's, we need to make that point, and perhaps with some humor as well.
I've heard people say that the venture capitalist looks for the slugging average, not the batting average.
Yes. The second point, I guess, that I would take off is we need to, we have a variety of public-private partnerships in the country, not only for the advancement of technologies, but for the provision of transportation services, for a variety of other things. And then I think this whole area needs to be studied a bit more analytically than it has been in the past. There's really no understanding of what the design principles are and how these design principles can be matched to the analytical challenges of that's the particular collective action problem that is presented by this public by this particular partnership. In the economics, speaking as we have a panel of economists here, and perhaps there are a few sprinkled in the audience as well, but economists know that there are a variety of collective action problem challenges, everything from public good problems to information asymmetries, and a variety of these different partnerships try to address one or two of these different types of collective action problems. And so, but there's very actually little analytical rigor brought to understanding these. Very often it's just, let's try this and let's see whether it works or not. So that's the second point. The third point is, I think we need to also pay attention to what the rest of the world is doing. There are a variety of very interesting public-private partnerships underway around the world, and we need to keep track of them, see what they're doing, and learn from their best practices as well.
Well, thank you very much. And as I listened to you, I thought in some ways this is what Professor Gansler is up to at the University of Maryland. He certainly is looking at what the rest of the world is doing. In terms of educating the policy community, I heard some suggestions about sending a certain group of those policymakers back to school. Maybe that was an overinterpretation.
Only 535 of them.
And of course the idea of compared to what, which one of the points that Sue was making. And I think the idea of bringing behavioral economics more fully into the economic space will yield really big dividends.
And can I add, since it's not work for me, but it's work for Sue? I'll miss the quote, but was it a Supreme Court judge that said, states are the laboratories of and I think that's exactly right. And it's, it's just punt to them. It's like, help us figure it. And I think they do. And I think it's a wonderful mechanism at our disposal to say,
Famous book, Laboratories of Democracy, but really now they're laboratories of innovation and
they
certainly
are,
public-private
and
partnerships.
it's a rich resource to leverage.
And I would just quickly plug a recent academy study in that we just completed a study on best practices in state innovation policies, which actually Dr. Wessner will be talking to the NGA in Chicago later this month.
Well, Professor Gansler, thank you very much. Panel, thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause. Terrific panel. thank you all.
No, thank you. So I'll have
You were already on our radar, but now you're on my radar, so that's nice.
You were terrific.
Oh, thank you.
I was involved in omnibus trade.